Good day, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you join us today. I am Sunity Maharaj, and here with me is Chike Pilgrim, Amilcar Sanatan, and Attillah Springer. They are among the legacies of 1970, but we will get to their story in due course. As we start to discuss the legacies of 1970 and the Black Power movement, the Black Power Revolution, and what it means to all of us 50 years later, I would like to open with on a note of respect and appreciation for the life of Raymond Watts. Many of you may not know Raymond Watts, but he is the person to whom is credited the idea of the 1968 or was it 69 Black Writers Conference in Montreal. And that was a springboard. It came in the middle of the Black Power movement in North America, which had echoes in Trinidad. And was the single most important political and literary moment that spiraled off into had so many echoes. And of course, one of the most outstanding speakers of that event was Kwame Ture, our own Stokely Carmichael. As he left Trinidad as Stokely Carmichael and went into the world and became Kwame Ture. So Raymond passed last week quietly in the calm of COVID-19, and we all know what that has done to loss of life and our farewells. But I think this is an appropriate moment to recognize the contribution of a man who brought the world of literature and language to a political movement. So let's get on with the conversation. And I want to turn to Chike first. I have already said that all three of you are the legacies of 1970, because I'm assuming none of you was around. And you would have been sprung out of the hopes. I know, Chike, you have produced a book, Power, this year, and I think that you recorded quite a number of conversations. Did you do it yourself, or did you record it from other sources and so on? And then maybe you can open the conversation by telling us about your engagement with that moment through those who lived it.
Right. I did a number of interviews, over about 20 interviews. So the book is made up of two parts. The first part is available now. The first part consists of 10 interviews with Bucka Rennie, Teddy Belgrave, may he rest in peace, Winston Sweet, Joe Young, R.I.P. as well, Michael Alves, R.I.P., Kafra Kambon, Ezeli Daga, Josanne Leonard, Fidi Ferreira, and Rafiq Shah. So that's the first book. I conducted these interviews over a period of about 5 years, from 2010 to 2015. It was part of a thesis that I did at the UE. My thesis was on Black Power. So while I was writing around the issue of Black Power, I decided to do these interviews, and I thought that I always intended to turn them into a book, and I finally got the time over the past couple of years to consolidate them.
And what feeling did that leave you with, hearing those stories?
Yeah, well, I mean, they were exciting, insightful. It was very emotional, because of course we're all from Trinidad and Tobago here. So just getting these stories, getting these insights, at times it was difficult to record, at times it was difficult to write and to rewrite and to transcribe and to research. So I would say it was a pretty emotional experience, actually. the issues of 70 are still very close to the surface in Trinidad and Tobago and in the world, as 2020 has made quite apparent. So we're still grappling with a number of these issues. So it felt current to have this book up here at this point in time. I didn't intend to be in Trinidad. So one of my Rasta brethren told me that I got brought back, you know, to finish this up. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know, we started when the idea of this conversation was first discussed. We were in a different world. We were talking about a retrospective on 1970. We were going to look back at the 50 years, and then other things happened. The Black Lives Movement erupted, and COVID entered the scene as well. And COVID itself has been wrapped up in the discussion about inequality, about marginalization, or about race and class, and how these things are translated into people's lives. So we are in a different world where we have to ask ourselves, are we in some way back in 1970? Now, even if you were not there, and any one of you can come in here, in fact, I mean, it's a conversation. Do you feel any sense of the recent events involving Black Lives Movement, the election campaign in Trinidad, where race talk erupted in, you know, just like a rash? Did you feel that those were that these are the stirrings of another moment, or do you feel it's just ordinary and par for the course? Do you feel that we are in a revolutionary time, or do you feel we've left revolution behind?
I think that we're always in a revolutionary time. I wonder if the people are ready for revolution. It's interesting that one of the things that happened as part of the conversation that was going on during the Black Lives Matter protests that happened in Trinidad is that people were saying, oh, this have nothing to do with us. How we get involved in that? This is America business, etc. Completely forgetting that the first big protest that happened on the 26th of February, 1970, was actually a solidarity protest for the young people who were in Canada. So, you know, I guess the lack of context that we have and the lack of awareness of our own history just makes these moments all the more important as teaching moments. And it's surprising that, you know, none of the media houses really took the opportunity to contextualize what was going on in Trinidad at the time. In the midst of all of these things that were happening, there was an opportunity for some contextualization to happen, and it didn't, you know. And, you know, all of us are talking about surviving COVID, how many hours we spend on Netflix every day, how the technology is changing our existence. And then when something in America happens, which affects Black people, people of African descent all over the world, we act like if that's their business and we are not involved in that conversation. So, I mean, the moment could be absolutely revolutionary, but if people are not in a state of mind for revolution, I think that's where the challenge comes in. I feel like in 1970, there was a kind of groundswell that happened that is possibly happening here in little pockets. And people are definitely fed up. People are definitely concerned, but you know, the reality of COVID has made it really difficult for us to, you know, gather to have conversations in person that really make a difference to the way that we organize, you know, so, yeah.
Amilcar?
Yes, Sunity, and I really appreciate the comments by everyone before. I think the first thing I want to establish is that language or that conversation you wanted to bring about the legacy of the 70s. Most definitely, we could see like our names, like, it's so funny when people saw me when I was very young, they thought it was my stage name sometimes. Like, how did you call yourself Amilcar Sanatan? And I'm literally named after Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau. My brother is named Fidel after Castro. My youngest brother, Marcus, after Gavi. So there was a cultural revolution that took place among many of us, which said that even if the political outcomes of a revolution, all of them may not have been achieved, some will, but there were cultural ones that would go to bring about a long-term change, which reflected that consciousness of that generation. A second aspect is also the idea of the university and what education should do to serve the needs of people. The idea of public intellectualism, but also a proletarian intellectualism, why everyone must read the newspapers, why commentaries must have a public format, the role of pamphlets, right, on promenades to engage people, and the type of publications which may take more in the place of blogs and even extended tweets of personalities using the platform to continually raise awareness around it. That has an important role to play around information dissemination, having conversations in a more democratic way, and one that is very conscious about reaching to people who will not traditionally access education. But then the last point I think is also around media and visibility. There is, I think, more legitimacy to our ideas. While it may have certain prejudice that we will always have to resist, the way that we could present ourselves on the media, national media, is very important. And I think that is an inheritance of that movement and the type of consciousness that was there. I don't take for granted every time I may get the opportunity to communicate to the public, and there's no anxiety around it. Well, probably they do, but it wasn't enough and it wasn't as powerful to remove me from a conversation. I remember when there was even a time where I was asked to put my hair back in a Caribbean institution, right, that is very prestigious, saying that maybe Amilcar shouldn't have his hair all out because the camera wouldn't get to see his face. Like if that was the most important contribution I had to make. So these are the kind of questions that we always have to grapple with. But I think Attillah was going to a great place. I think where we have to look at our work is how does Black Power, for all that we do, really challenges hegemony, challenges an idea of dominance in a particular moment. And we are aware of what that dominance is. Probably we need to be more explicit about what it is and what changes we want. And I think what it really showed up was the lack of leadership also, and not the idea of a single leader or a kind of savior to our cause. Yes, people want horizontal leadership. Yes, probably don't draw straight line to leaders the same way that we did in the past. And we have more responsibilities, portfolios, sacrifice for our time, mental health care, all these new questions, and of course, more women than men. But I think it really asks a question about acknowledging the spectrum in which mobilizing around anti-Black racism happens, and to not buy into one narrative, and not be hostile as well. We should be generous in the way we seek to understand people, understand the limits of their politics, probably stand up where we feel our integrity lies, but understand that all of us are important actors to those changes.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt that what has been happening is that the people have been insisting on a place around the table, and new claimants give rise to claimants that you don't even see at that moment. There was a time it was based on color, race, it was based on gender, it was based on sexuality. And even now, as we think that we are very sensitive to all the rights of everyone, we may not even know, we may not even be aware of the voices that are being left out. And they will surface at some time, and we have to be alert to the fact that who we see now and eventually come to accept, when we see somebody else comes, it doesn't mean that, okay, we have blocked off the space, you always be open. Chike, you wanted to say something?
No, I'm just building on what Amilcar and Attillah was saying. I would like to add to that it's time that we formalize these traditions, meaning 1930, the 1950s, 1970, 1990, within our education system. We need to introduce this into the history syllabus. The books should be available, they should be there. People should be teaching around these things and discussing these things. I don't think that the youth, to add to what Amilcar is saying, should be grappling in a moment like this to find some kind of place within the tradition. We shouldn't be recreating the wheel. Whether or not you agree with one part of the topic or another part of the topic, the point is there's a very wide discussion that has been happening in the Caribbean for almost hundreds of years, you know, as far as the issues of race, class, gender, and so on are concerned. So I think introducing these things, we should move away from some of the nervousness that I think we have with respect to these crucial moments, and teach the children about these things, you know.
Yeah, well, we got to go beyond 1937, eh? You know, but should we explore that issue though? I think that maybe we ourselves need to give a little context for anybody who is on this discussion about 1970. Let's just go back a little bit to I think Attillah was talking about the fact that we tap into, and others tap into us as well, global movements and thoughts and ideas. It's a world of ideas, and what is interesting is how ideas moved long before social media. And today you can, you know, at a click of a whatever, you can connect to anybody. But I've always been fascinated by how ideas move in the Caribbean. If you look back to that period with Garvey, you go back to the British West Indian movement, a British West Indian regiment that came back, and how people communicated across the region. Well, of course, the indigenous people were communicating by sea as though it was their highway. They were up and down the place, right? And so ideas have been flowing, and we have been connecting and tapping into them and feeding them as well. And that is what was going on in the 60s. And if we consider the age of the leaders of the Black Power revolution of 1970, these would have been, if you were to look maybe at Daga and Cambon, as say the two best known leaders, they would have been about, I don't know, about 12 or 13, assuming they were in university in 1970 at about, they probably would have been about 20. And so they would have been, I'm talking about when we got to independence, sorry. When we got to independence, they would have been boys, but they would have been flushed with a sense of what independence meant, what they were to expect and grow up into. And then by the time they got to 20, and they are at university, and they're looking at their own odds at what is going to happen in their lives and what is around them, the environment in Trinidad was one that was highly politicized in the 60s. It came out of the People's National Movement, and Dr. Eric Williams came with his Woodford Square lectures. Large numbers of people attended these things, and these were rank and file. This was a proletariat, as it were, eager to try to make sense of the world and anxious for the independence. And so you had an already politicized national community, largely so urban. Then you had independence, and then you had almost a decade of waiting for independence to happen, the promise of change. And then by the time we got to the 1968, I remember Jennifer Kernahan Jones, Beverly Jones's sister, talking about growing up in that Laventille, Belmont area, where there were every night the blocks were of young people sitting down with the most revolutionary literature of the time, Mao Zedong's the Communist Manifesto, the Marxists, whatever, talking under the streetlights, debating and discussing and so on. And there was people who were trying to, they weren't in the university. These are not people necessarily in the university, though they may be connected, but they were talking about what it meant to them. And so you had an environment that was heavily into discussion. Is that comparable to the discussion on social media today? What do you think?
I want to see Guam come across as a hater. So let them go first. Because I'm salty, but I have some context to give. But go ahead, not me.
I mean, I have like a slight bit of salt, like slight salt and slight aloes.
Salt Bay, kind of.
Salt Bay. Okay. Listen, there's so much noise on social media. There's so much noise. You're competing with so much all the time. You're competing with, you know, a certain level of hotepery, right? So you're competing with people who have this hyper fantastic idea of what Africa is and what Pan-Africanism looks like. And that is feeding into also a very hyper-vigilant policing of people's language, which is also moving into questions of intersectionality and where women are in the movement, into questions of Pan-Africanism, into questions of what the complete, perhaps, erasure of the history of Black power and the history of movements, the history of Caribbean people in Pan-African movements, which is something that concerns me a lot. And Sunity, when you were talking about Marcus Garvey, when you were talking about the T.A. Murray show, the West Indies must be West Indian. We didn't even mention Henry Sylvester Williams organizing the first Pan-African conference. All of this conversation is somehow missing from, again, I'm really concerned about context. And so constantly we are feeling like the conversation is now starting. And I've had so many experiences in the last 10 years of being involved in various movements, whether they are environmental movements, women's movements, and having conversations with people, arguing with them about the importance of talking about the history of colonial violence or the context of our resistance to talking about movements in the present period. And people actively arguing with me about, you know, my desire to talk about these things within a particular context, because they say that it's not relevant. Race is not relevant. We don't want to talk about them things. This is not what this is about. And if you bring up race, if you bring up class, people are going to get upset. And I'm like, yeah, well, they need to get upset because, you know, we need to take the conversation there. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that we can't wait until the thing is happening for us to have the conversation. And for all of us who have been trying for years to have this conversation and trying to contextualize our own experiences as children, having people laugh at your name, asking you what it is that mean, you know, if you wear anything looking remotely African outside of emancipation, people laughing at you, people, you know, there's so much that goes on. And now we have reached a point where the conversation is going on. And lots of people who I was never looking for there are the most vocal, the most revolutionary, the most radical. And I'm like, yeah, but where were you when I was trying to have this conversation with you when we were organizing a protest against the killing of a woman at carnival time? You know, you did not want to have this conversation then. Why do you want to have it now? Because it's fashionable. You know, you didn't want to have the conversation when we were talking about this. We were talking about the difference between rural and urban development when there was a protest going on in South for the smelter. You didn't want to have the conversation then. That's when the conversation needs to happen, because all of those things, all of the questions of how we develop our society, of how women are treated in our society, all of those things come out and have a context and have a history and have a reason for why they exist in the society as they do. And if we don't deal with them, then they manifest in this way, and then everybody gets on shock like if they didn't know. Everybody's suffering from I never thought, you know? And so That's my saltiness coming out there, but I don't know if anybody else have any other saltiness
Go on,
to add. But
Chike, you or you want me to go, Chike?
I am not against things being fashionable. I'm not against people riding a wave or a carousel or jumping on a bandwagon, you know. We're on the earth is a bandwagon, you know. I've been a part of many bandwagons, and I've gravitated to more serious issues through fashion, music, different aspects of culture, you know. So what I think is important with what Attillah is saying is that I think if we're not kind of having those open discussions on an ongoing basis and presenting it within the framework of our society, whether it's through some cultural representation or education or whatever the case may be, then we kind of run the risk of either having this huge disconnect between the people that are affected the most by the issues, or people not knowing how to express themselves. And when people don't know how to express themselves, you know, we know that manifests as violence, you know. So what someone was telling me really is that they were talking about 90, and they were saying that 90 was really a kind of incredible experience for those who had gone through 70, because they saw it as being a situation where some young man on the street or young woman on the street could actually do harm to one of the elders of 70, you know, without knowing who that was, who the person was, how important the person may have been, or how the person could contextualize what was actually happening in 1990. You know, so those are the kind of risks that we run by constantly seeking to return these experiences to the shadow space, you know. So, I mean, I'm not against, like I said, the fashion. I'm not salty with the Facebook talk, and I like to read it. I don't like to talk too much, but it's entertaining, it's good. I think that people being sensitized through, you know, social media is not a bad thing at all. And social media, Black Lives Matter is a social media movement. But at the same time, if we don't have an ongoing kind of education, then we run the risk of having a very large disconnect. So that's my thoughts on that.
We're going to get a very salty views of Amilcar, and I want to bring into the conversation two persons who have commented, and one is responding directly to the issue that Chike and Attillah, Kimi Ramneen, or is it Ramnarayan? I suppose it must be Ramnarayan. Says this is a very important question, which is when and how people enter conversations of justice. How do people who are just starting to get engaged become more involved? And I suppose that the issue there is starting with what? Because if you entered a conversation at the point at which you started, but you brought to it, and this is where the issue of education comes in, if you brought it a certain amount of information, and what Attillah is saying is that over and over, you have to tell that story of why, and have people say, really, that happened here? Right? And then we have Hugh Lawrence, who says, are we unified today to come together for a common cause? Or are the times we are currently living in filled with distractions to ensure that we do not unify? So that's the point of whether there is some kind of, you know, deliberate issue to it, right? So let me hear you, Amilcar, if you want to deal with any of these or incorporate them, or give us straight out your saltiness.
Yeah, man, it's not a bad mind, you know, I mean, because I think all of us here, I mean, you're seasoned with salt as well, you know, and to enhance the taste. All of us here are actively involved in social media in some form or the other, and it's central to our organizing as well. But there are some things we need to really challenge and to put into context, which is the lack of historical reference points, not acknowledging that Facebook is an American corporation, not acknowledging that you have been consuming literature almost entirely from the United States, right? Is not acknowledging that you're not reading content from within your space. And sometimes when you embrace that language, you embrace that dialogue, you may also reproduce some harm from misreading your context. The famous thing about this is cultural appropriation. Someone looked at a Ganesh tattoo on my hand and asked me if I'm appropriating Hinduism. And you know, like, I was like, where did I reach in the world that somebody would know me, would pull my arm and then ask me about cultural appropriation, not nuancing dialogues when they circulated globally, right? We draw on the progressive elements, but we have to really challenge the parts that don't really fit. And I know Sunity, you have done very serious work around that, Lloyd Best, and the epistemological problematique that comes about in the way knowledge moves itself. So I think next thing is also organizing. The assumption that you could signal virtue to show how great you are and stand on the point of justice doesn't really create a conversation about growth, for which the best of our leaders have also done and will continue to do. Growth is part of our ethic and politics. And less than holding people accountable to the status, maybe we need to look at the common thread, how a person will think over a period of time. Signaling virtue is so separate from collective organizing, where individuals posture and have a false sense of power for which politicians are not impressed by, so it really doesn't bring about the kind of changes they think they may be doing, is that it really not looking at collective work. I usually ask people, well, which organization you are part of? What institution do you work with? When you say you're allied to which union or which movement? And I think when we start to extend the question, not that we all need to become members or to be organized on the shop floor, right? But it's that we need to begin to not over-exaggerate our significance to advancing a movement, a cause, or a goal. And I think what I embrace from it is I love is the vocabulary. It is a form of informal education where people learn outside of the classroom. And it brings about a politics of accountability. It shows consciousness. It also helps us identify potentially new leaders for movements who develop community. We don't need to only see it as followers, they also develop community. But just to the last point, there was a time I went to a secondary school long south, and I finished my presentation and I tried to make sure that, you know, it's a religious institution. You know, I put some things there that I know people traditionally will not feel comfortable about, but I buttoned my crease as well, cool. And then afterwards, a young man came up to me, Mr. Sanatan, I really enjoyed the presentation, but I think you did a cisgendered analysis of gender relations. And that is when I knew I was becoming obsolete. So where I was always at the, you know, like when I went to another school in Port of Spain, so how we could get more pro-feminist boyfriends? You know, that is the question they're asking me in a Caribbean studies class. And I wanted to know that even the priority that I had as a 17-year-old had long gone. It was answered and resolved, not by all persons, but many young persons have got to that point on their own, took it as natural and wanted new starting points. And that is what social media allows us to assess.
Mm-hmm. But does it not also, you know, I'm troubled by the algorithms that puts you in a bubble that you think is the world. And if you were not in the world of Facebook or any one of these social media, and you are educating yourself, you are in charge of your education, and you're finding the things that you want to go towards. Is that a better way of having done it? Like I am really troubled by algorithms because social media always think one of the things I deal with was throw that up at me all the time. And I am not that kind of, you know, reader or explorer. I just want to see, consume everything, you know. Is what we're seeing on social media the result of that streaming of people into marketing audiences, which is what the algorithm is about, that this is what you looked at, and therefore this, you are part of a group that could buy so-and-so products, and that's when the ads and so on start coming at you, and therefore it is limiting your idea and your views of what is consensus, because I mean there's consensus within your bubble, and you think, well, all of us in the world think this way, and we must therefore be right. And a whole other conversation is going on elsewhere, and you have not been directed to that. And people are therefore, in the absence of coming to things with a body of knowledge and information, which is what school and community gives you, they cannot make sense of that. They think that is the world. They cannot, you have to be able, don't you have to have some level of critical faculty to sift and filter in order to find something that is meaningful. And if you come at it without some basic information, we have come back to the issue. I think Chike raised the point about the education system. Now I know that's a biggie for us, all of us, in that the reason that we are here talking, and we are talking about the possibility that somebody in 1990 would not know one of the leaders of 1970, is because you don't go to school and read anything about that. You're not encouraged. And when you go to primary school and they give you, and you talk about your country, you know, we all know the famous thing, you know, Caribbean Arabs and Christopher Columbus, and that's about it, right? How do we break out of this recurring decimal of constantly having to start over and everybody joining the conversation later, but from the same point of zero, that gives you, that wastes so much time of your life? And you get to the point of Attillah of saying it, you know, it's just noise. I mean, when are we moving to the point of organizing and action and so on? How do we break out of that trap? Through the education system. How do we come to a level of discussion as whether we're 15-year-olds or 16-year-olds, but we have some shared idea of information about what has happened in this part of the world for as long as it has been here, if not through the education system.
I mean, people are not, sorry.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to say that people are not sharing family stories. You know, I'm a kind of member of the Bois Academy of Trinidad and Tobago. And one of the things that happens within that community is that you have people who are now studying stick fight tradition, they're now studying Kalinda. Mm-hmm. And when they go home and, you know, some older person in their family finds out that they are having this engagement with stick fight, that is when they hear, oh, you know, your great grandfather used to do that, and he was a stick fighter from so, and he got his head bust, and it had an incident where blah, 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 blah was the case, right? And this non-sharing of family story is a real crisis, I think, for our people. Because
you want to explore why, though. I mean, that's a symptom, but it has to be the source of the problem. What is responsible for that?
Well, I think that there's a certain level of shame associated with family history, or there's a certain level of bacchanal that, you know, that we inherit, and, you know, there's a falling out with this one or that one. But, you know, what I appreciated about both of my parents is that they constantly talked about their mother, their grandmother, where they came from. I know my great grandmother was born in Barbados just after emancipation. She could not even name enslavement. She called it that thing because she was so terrified of it, although she was not born during enslavement. And she left Barbados. I know her whole story of leaving Barbados and going to Panama and helping, you know, being one of those people who had built the canal and saving up all her money through Susu and thing, and being an investor in Marcus Garvey's Black Star Line project, and being a Garveyite, going and buying a house in Grenada on Lucas Street. I know my family's history, and it is also the history of the region. So that, you know, through my family history, I have an entry point into the history of the region. To go back into what you were talking about before, about the continuing cycle, I know my connection to Garveyism. I know my connection to Pan-Africanism. I know my connection to Venezuela through Sucre province. I know all of those things. I know my connection to Black Caribs in St. Vincent. But people are not sharing these stories. And is it because, you know, I don't think it's that the oral history is not there. I think that we stopped telling stories to our children. And now you have a situation where we expect things to be written down in book, but to sit down and talk with my father about his father's nickname, which was Vanquish. You know, he came from a village in Grenada called Chantimel, where they were never enslaved. They were bonded laborers who came. You know, we have these stories. We have the history that is not written in the history books. I know that history because I also live it every day. The stories that I have, I am told by my parents, and now that they are approaching 80 and they repeat their stories, I have now reached a point where I can repeat them for them and say, you know, if they forget, Sideways was a man who used to live behind the bridge in 1970. He was bipolar, and sometimes he would go sideways. He was a great intellect. You know, I know these stories because my father told me these stories, you know, and I'm just saying that we have a rich oral history. And I just want to encourage young people to interview older people in their families, particularly in this time when we are losing older people. Don't wait for the education system. Just talk to older people in your family. This is one of the things that I perhaps enjoy the most, talking to older people about what life was like back in the day. You know, sometime in the future, we will be the ones who will be like, yeah, remember that time when Marshall was performing and saying, and you know, that will be our history. Or remember that time when it had COVID and we didn't get out to lockdown for 3 years, not trying to put goat mouth on the whole scene, but you know, the oral history is crucial. And it's easier now for us to document the oral history without having to write it down. Just point a voice note at somebody and get them to record.
I take your point very strongly, but I developed this term I call engineered amnesia, and that is engineered through the education system. And one of the positions, and I mean you could challenge this if you want, that I have, is that I am tired of the fact that the things that are important to us have to be marginalized outside of the formal system. I don't want the oral.
Agreed.
I absolutely accept we have to encourage the oral history. That's our history, the oral history, documentation, and so on. But I do not think the state should be allowed to continue taking all the apparatus that taxpayers pay for and all the funds and all the systems and resources that it has, to be allowed to continue deploying it in the service of history that is pointless and meaningless, while all these troopers like yourself and other people, so many individuals are doing that work so hard and don't have those resources. I think these things, the apparatus should be commanded for our purposes. And that we really.
But Sunity, that's why Lloyd Best Institute is so crucial. And maybe the state is 20 years behind schedule, but we have to be consistent in the work that we do. And I mean, you have been toiling in the vineyards longer than I have. And, you know, the work is so important, whether the state understands it or recognizes it or not, the work is important. And the fact that we are here persevering and doing the work and having visibility to do the work as well. We don't actually need the Ministry of Education anymore. We have the power to set up our own digital platforms. We have the power to set up our own culture ministry or whatever the institution.
Right? I don't think we should let them get out.
I totally agree. I totally agree. But at some point, they're gonna get the memo. At some point, maybe there'll be somebody inside of one of these institutions. And I do think that there are people within the ministries that understand, that get it. And we just have to keep chucking them choking them, like
Well, I
today.
think that's very relevant.
Just a little subtle choke. Just a little subtle
I think
choke.
it's about time. It's just going on too long. I want to welcome back Chike to the conversation because he dropped
sorry
out.
about that.
And I want to acknowledge a comment here from Brandon O'Brien saying that further to Attillah and Amilcar's point, I have a question. What ways are there for some of us to remain engaged when we often don't have the stamina for public action or often headed public debate? Not sure what the last part means, if he means that he's tired of that heading public debate as well. But okay, you want to rejoin us, Chike?
Yeah, the stamina for public action. Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, Attillah has been one of the people that has been kind of operating as an activist and as a trooper and as someone that is a social conscience and so much work that goes into just kind of confronting the issues, you know. I think that we need to accept that we are not healing without confronting these issues. We are not moving forward as a society without understanding our culture or the various cultures and our various histories, you know? It's just not happening. And that does need to be acknowledged on the state level. I think there's some fear. I think there is an unwillingness to acknowledge the difficult things and to have the difficult conversations. There are people that are in positions of power right now that owe their positions in the society, whether it's at a judicial level, a political level, an economic level, to the grapplings of the 30s, the 50s, the 70s, you know? In my household, though, there was not that open conversation, and I know that in a lot of households, it wasn't quite like Attillah's. There wasn't that open conversation. I think that that people kind of didn't.
Okay, so I think there sounds like there seems like there's a technical problem. Amilcar, you want to pick this up?
Yes, no problem. If I may, I think I would start with, you know, something I try to raise with people who work in these areas, have a deep consciousness in it, and more so even scholars abroad who sometimes have a tendency, when it is not at its best, when they don't do their work their best, to totalize the Caribbean, to say that he is either inherently radical or inherently backward and not moving up to par. And that is why I think ethnography, or even just anthropology in general, really brings out the best, the closeness to life stories and meanings. And I know Attillah was trying to speak to that. Last year, I was tutoring a course at the university. Put up a picture of capitalism and slavery, put up a picture of Eric Williams in his graduation gown and say, who is that? And not one person could answer that question. And no, that could say a lot about the matriculation standards and what kind of people coming in here. But it's less to do with the university, actually, is what they did not have before they came. And this is an environment where most of the students would have written Caribbean studies for sixth form at Cape. And it has history, geography, and economics as core components of it. Some of these schools, which are considered to be prestigious, have literature as a compulsory subject, or history, or another language. And when you study a language, you really also understand the history and the culture of that language, or the many countries that share that language. So what is that gap? At the end of the day, we have to be evangelical about this mission with history. There's no two ways about it. I can't sit down and analyze. For me, critique could never be enough. It's really working to create that narrative, and all the oral studies projects and the archival work that we do, and the GAIAP and the Panchat, you know, the Creole that you're trying to teach Sunity. That is the important work to reach the persons that can help not just understand the importance of it in the past, but to see its relevance in the present. And I think that is when history becomes useful. So as a young person, I was very aware of history, was all around me. But I realized that it was also dead, that many streets are named after people I look up to, but persons will walk past it because they didn't even care about street names. So there was a geographic problem, which made the history kind of null and void. But there's an interesting thing, and this is what I always try to tap into. There's something potentially radical or open to possibilities when people do not think they are constructed by history, therefore they are not confined by its shortcomings as well. And there's an opening we could have, not to exploit that or manipulate people, but to guide them to more open ways of thinking about it. So the question is not that history is not taught, but what histories are taught. There are certain narratives. There's the kind of light switch of independence to break away from a colonial past. All students know that we are no longer colonial, but never trouble that statement itself. What does no longer mean? Can one be no longer colonial? What does independence and the kind of hubris we have around that statement that we're now free? That's something we are taught. So part of the language and nationalism, has real shortcomings. And the way we think about different nationalisms fighting for space. And that's why, like in French, you have the idea of savoir and connaître, two verbs to know, which it says to know, but savoir, to know something almost intellectually, connaître, to be familiar with it, to intimately know something. And I also think people need to walk through history. Of course, I'm biased to the idea of a cultural history. And I don't think history should only be understood because it is relevant to your identity, the one you articulate, but rather the one that we share in a space. So geography gives us a sense of place. When I saw the temple on the sea, I thought that was a mythology that was relevant to me. That you could determine not just a place to worship, but you could reclaim parts of the sea to create more land for you to pray. For some reason, that was a radical idea to me. I didn't have to be a Hindu. I didn't have to be an Indian. I didn't have to live in that part of Trinidad. But that is what mattered to me. You don't have to be a Roman Catholic to go Mount St. Benedict. And perhaps you realize colonizers always had the best point of view, but the point of view is what was relevant to people, not the process that enabled persons to take piece of a mountain and then look out and say, this is perspective. So thinking about public space, thinking about persons walking through history and seeing how it connects to their struggles in their life, I think becomes important. And that is why that we could advocate on sexualities that may not be our own or what we identify with. We advocate for justice for ethnic groups because we understand that they live here and they need to find peace and dignity in their lives, not just because I feel this way. And I think that is what liberates us. History is very practical and pragmatic and to apply to our problems in the present.
Well, if we understand that the temple in the sea is really, for me, really was a powerful act of resistance, then we would understand what we have in common with Sadhu. That is not Sadhu versus somebody else, whatever. What we have had is resistance. And that is what he did. Said you couldn't build your temple on land, okay, I'll go in the sea and put it, And what a thing to have done.
Exactly.
How many buckets of cement you carry to get enough to stand up from the bottom of the sea up? We have comments here from Mark Skinner and John Arley. And Mark is saying that the issue isn't that 1970, 90 isn't a part of the curriculum. It's that it isn't taught, one, in the right way, and two, equally across all schools. And that this is coming from a QRC old boy of 22. It wasn't taught. And then John Lee says, he asks, who are the policy leaders, guides, shapers of our educational curricula and systems? What about the place of traditional and social media in education? And what place for alternative educational systems? So I think what he's describing there is the universe of possibilities for teaching, because school is not the only place. We know that. Home is not the only place. Social media is not the only place, but do you have a learning environment where there are certain things that are shared? What school does is it puts everybody in one place with one story. And that is why there is so much of, and so much of, an importance on it. You're investing, and society invests in a view of itself through history when it allocates teachers and school buildings and all these things. Because when you go out there in your community, you may get a partial view from this person, all kinds of things. You go social media, but the education system is the one that carries the responsibility for all. And we're discovering now what it is like when you don't have a school these days. Because school is where one teacher, everybody in the same uniform, have the same textbook. It levels everybody regardless of where you come from. You go into a classroom and all of you have the same thing more or less, even the lunch. And if you get school feeding. And now everybody is in a different classroom. And if your classroom has a computer or it works, and if yours has noise in the background, and if yours has whatever, all kinds of things, all the inequality and inequities of individual lives are now on Zoom in the modern classroom that we have in the pandemic classroom. And so all the questions about how does this take things back and forward, I mean, that's a whole different conversation that we're not here to talk about today, but it does point to the role of the education system as a leveler and as a carrier of, and so if that is flawed, and that is where you're putting your resources, well, then you ought to do something about it. It can't, I don't know, I just think I have seen too many lives invested in this work come to the end of their life and then see people starting from scratch to think, we should go on with this. This has to come to a point. And this is where where the organization may come in, but to challenge the education system and rattle it,
But Sunity, if I may, because I think this is where I really embrace from Attillah's point about the autonomous work that happens. The reality is, I don't think the state may engineer even that amnesia because it doesn't serve their interests. You have an entire generation, but you have an entire generation that don't know the prime minister, don't know the MP. They go into the wrong office when they have a petition. They ball up anybody, come in the name of politics. So like, even in the interest of people with power, is it better for people to know history and civics and their landscape? And there's an interesting thing though. There are schools that produce these culturally empowered minds who have a deeper sense of place than some other students. And that is because they have key teachers who had a kind of commitment and sometimes a Puritan ethic. Music teachers, a famous parang teacher, a very important history teacher, not just only getting ones, but really expanding the mind. And there are many schools across Trinidad that have these key persons, a very popular sociology teacher in the East, who really expand the person's minds to think radically at 16. And what I loved about going to school in sixth form was everybody have the Haralambos and Holborn and full communists, and by the time you finish exams and you like the parties after, you start to slow down, right? Well, not me, but there was a way that school itself does unlock your mind much more than others would. But I think why sixth form enables that was also the role of free periods, that you were allowed to exercise more leadership in the school and you got clubs. And you also saw the role of peer-to-peer leadership. You got to govern a lot more than you would where you were disciplined before. What does that mean? I don't think teaching history is really just an intellectual moment or for people to acknowledge these key points. But there's a certain swag and a style that history must give to a person, that it really gives them more power in their everyday life. And I guess that is what I want to speak to. And that is why Marshall Montano will have a concert and people will whine to Big Truck, even though they're whining to whichever roadmap you throw down on we this year. Because he himself has institutionalized his career. And I know that sounds like one career and we shouldn't compare it to society. But that is an example of artists not being forgotten, also not wanting to be forgotten, and creating an intergenerational dialogue around his craft. And Bunji Garlin does that also, I think a little bit less, but key artists throughout the world do that. The Social Club in Cuba, Veloso and all them in Brazil with Bossa Nova. We see artists do it as well.
I just want to, since we're on the topic of soca, I just want to deviate a little bit and say, Shadow in 1981 or so had this record. I don't know if you could see it behind me. It's kind of blurry. It's called the Zest Man.
I know it.
And
yeah.
I remember posting that on social media and asking, what do you know about Zest? And people messaging me to ask me if that was a real record. Right? Yeah. So I'm just saying that I
think I have it right there.
to reconfirm the point that we are so contextless in our deliberations, even within our culture. And
that's a moment though, but that's a moment for learning, eh? And
it's such a learning process. So all of a sudden you have all of these people, all of a sudden I was going viral on Twitter because all of these young people was like, Shadow is really the original Zest Man. So it's making people look again at the forms that exist in their midst,
Right.
right?
No,
And remember that they learned it from somewhere. They got it from somewhere. It didn't just appear in their head one day. They get it from somewhere. And this reminds me of a story that my dad would tell me about 1970 when he was selling copies of the NJAC newspaper at the time, which was called East Dry River Speaks. So he would go on Frederick Street and try and sell these copies because the sales would then be funneled back into doing work for the organization. And so he saw two older people passing, and he tried to sell them some, and they didn't take him on. And then he said, "We will reignite the spirit of Uriah Buzz Butler in this place." And that was the key for them to turn back and buy two from him, because he reconnected with something that they knew. He invoked something in their history that they recognized. They remember their days with Butler. They must have been, and it's like, how are we reigniting the people in our communities? How are we reigniting? How are we including people in our communities to ensure that they are activated to do the communication that needs to be done, to remind the young people of the richness
you see, that
of
point
our
about
story.
communication, though, what your father did there, that is what normal communication should be like for people who are teachers, leaders, anybody, parents. It's that there's a point at which a question is there hanging, and you just come in with the information. The man called himself, I'm a Zessa, and you say, here's shadow, so. And immediately you open a whole history, and that person is hooked. And that is the art of teaching too, right? And so that
exactly
there is a seamlessness. There's a seamlessness, but the questions I am more detained by is why, among the people who have that information, they do not release it, not even to their own children. In that moment, that's what I would call a teaching moment or a learning moment. But I want to say what Marina Silandi Brown, who, as you know, is a Bocas founder and director, has a question here, because I think she's trying to get us back to the discussion, which is in 1970, Marina. On the issue of races came together in 1970. What are the views of the panel on the sense of separation now? Chike, you've been a little quiet, being off Zoom for a minute. You want to take that one?
Yeah, I've been in and out. Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, on the issue of what she's saying is in 1970, she's stating that races came together in 1970. What do we think? What do you all think about the sense of separation now? First of all, you have to accept that there is a sense of separation. And you have to also accept that the races came together in 1970. So if you accept those two things, I guess the question is, what do you think, but how do you account for that? Is there some deviation, something that is lost, or something that is interpreted differently, or what? Are we more divided, I guess, is the question, no, than we were in 70?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. In 70, I think what was happening in Trinidad and Tobago is that it was kind of like a worldwide, many different movements were converging, and I don't think, to be fair to our listeners, we've described exactly what has been happening, but you had Michael Alves and Raymond Palakdari conducting the Young Power movement. That's in 1968 and 1969, right? Then, as we mentioned, the Montreal Congress of Black Writers, which was kind of like a Black Power / Pan-African kind of situation. Before that, you have CLR James giving a number of popular lectures in the 1960s throughout North America and Trinidad and Tobago. And then you have Williams, of course, giving his talk in the 50s and coming to power. But concerning the issues of race, I think you did have a number of Indian people involved in the movement and throughout the movement, right? So you had key people such as I mentioned, Raymond Palakdari Singh, you had Chan Maharaj, You had Rafiq Shah, of course, who was the rebel lieutenant.
Winston
Augustus Ramrekha Singh, who was
Winston Leonard.
Winston Leonard, right? Augustus Ramrekha Singh, who was a member of the Students Guild and so on, you know? So you have all these people that were involved on a personal and kind of individual level. However, at the time, there's that PNM, DLP, Democratic Labour Party, and People's National Movement kind of divide that's happening to some extent. Williams in '58, with his infamous statement, had kind of hurt members of the East Indian community. You know, the very notorious statement of a recalcitrant minority and all of that, although the claim is that he was not directing that at the Indian community per se, but at members of the DLP. Whichever way you want to take that, you can take it. I think that, however, the DLP being under Badesi Sagan Maharaj, who happened to be the uncle of Sat Maharaj,
Stepfather.
Yes,
Father-in-law. Father-in-law.
Yeah, father-in-law, and the founder of the
Mahasabha.
The Mahasabha, right? It's in the interest, in a sense, of these leaders to kind of maintain their power base, right? So if in any way the DLP, for instance, in the 50s and 60s was making inroads into the African community, or the PNM was doing the inverse, what you can do is that you can continue that colonial tradition of the divide and rule and whip up the masses and kind of get us into our camps of African Indian and get your voter base out to kind of have a kind of panic of, you know, this is who I represent, this is who I am. And we've seen that kind of thing happening throughout in Guyana. We've seen it happening in Trinidad and Tobago, where we have majority Indian and African community. So that's a challenge that we face. The Indian community in 70 as a majority did not get the opportunity to interact with the urban African community. The attempt to do so, the major march, well, after the March to Caroni, there was a major march that was supposed to happen on the 21st of April, and that's 1970, and that's when the state of emergency was called. So the sugar base, which was predominantly Indian at the time, and the oil and the urban young African community never really connected on that level. So it was kind of like an aborted attempt to kind of have that discussion between our communities. And I think that that discussion has not since then, well, maybe the National Alliance for Reconstruction to some extent, but since then and of course the efforts of the Lloyd Best Institute, I think, but that discussion has not been had in any real way since that time, you know? So I think that that's some of the kind of problems that we face with respect to the present time. To be honest, while there was Indian involvement in 70, the broader Indian community, which was largely rural, did not get the opportunity to enter into the Black Power movement in a significant way. The Young Power movement, however, run by Raymond Palak Singh and Michael Alls, was a very broad-based kind of South Trinidad, urban, rural, and Tobago kind of setup that allowed for that kind of wider discussion, you know?
Yeah, but
So,
I think that sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was saying that by 1970, the DLP was a spent force, absolutely leaving a vacuum that Pandey was able to come in very quickly into. And there was actually, I mean, I was in Central as a 11-year-old or something in 1970. And I really remember the excitement. And I was in Balmain village, Cuba, the excitement of our village. And it's predominantly Indians with the idea of Africans and Indians unite. I think Indians in ICOM, the ones that they were so excited by this idea. And I know my teachers who would be leaving school early to go in the march, right? And this was a very, I think Indians also could not, they were excited at the idea of an Afro-urban community that was at war with Williams. And they felt, oh, you're understanding now what it is we feel. And it's not about Williams, but the marginalization from the system of power and government. And there was a significant bonding. And I mean, the banner that is famous about Indians and Africans Unite really spoke to that movement, which was quite a number of people were in it. And they had to come to town to do the march. And of course, there's this play, March to Caroni, that is based on a lot of interviews with people that it was done at DCFA, and the way in which the Indians were greeted. I mean, sorry, the marchers were
Africans
greeted along the way, and all this fear that Bades had invoked and so on. Now, there's a very interesting postscript to that story that Raoul Pantin published in his 1970, his book
Black Power Day,
Black Power Day, in which he said, he phoned Bades. The march was going to go, right? And he phoned Bades the day before the march, and Bades was welcoming to the march, right? On the record. And then Bades changed his mind. And subsequently, and there's a famous story of how he came out in the front yard because there wasn't the highways and so on. They were going on the Eastern Main. The next day, and that the thinking was that there was some negotiation. There was also, in that, there was a lot of pressure on people to not endorse this march. And of course, the most famous one was the Archbishop of Port of Spain, who said he will join the march, and then went back on his word and said he's not gonna do it because the pressures that came down. And so there are pieces inside of the story that really don't fit a particular narrative, you know, and more work has to go on. You wanted to say something, Tilla?
Yeah, I wanted to say that in my readings, I found out that Brinsley Samaru was had encountered Walter Rodney while he was studying in London at LSE, right? And on returning home, he was like one of the first, you know, young Indian historians who was approached by Gaga, or Granger, Darbo. His students were Beverly Jones, Guy Harewood, and they approached him and asked him if he would do some education for them. And Brinsley also, Professor Samaru, was also one of the first people who went into rural Indian communities and actually spoke with them about Indian history in a way that they would not have had exposure to. So again, this thing about somebody actively taking responsibility for the education of people. And as Sunity was mentioning, the March to Caroni, which happened on the 13th, March 13th, 1970, where people walked, people offered food and sweet drink to the marchers, marched with them some way, although there was the threat of robbery and rape, you know, which is a classic threat that we still see being leveled against African people towards Indian people in this society. That, you know, that is a recurring decimal in the conversation that
goes
happens
right back.
between, and it goes right back to colonial days. That separation. You know, Indian women would run away from their nice Indian husbands to go and shack up with a black man somewhere. And you know, there are endless calypsos that document that. Yeah. But you know, I also want to go back again into the history and say that in 1884, when there was the Jahaji massacre, you know, Ravi Ji, who I am very lucky to count as one of my gurus, he talks about the fact that people walked from all over Trinidad. They walked from plantations all over Trinidad. So it would not have only been Muslims, Shia Muslim Indians, it would have been Hindus, it would have been Africans, it would have been Payal people, because everybody understood that these colonial authorities were trying to take away the right of people to have their cultural expression. And so this is something that was repeated time and again. And that whole question of African people in the urban areas being erased from the consciousness of the mainstream rank and file PNM party. I want to give a short, quick story here about going to Cuba and finding out that the Balize is actually called Sword of Shango, right? And posting that online and getting feedback from a friend in England who said, yeah, well, not only was Eric a science man, but he also was friends with a guy called Fernando Ortiz, who was one of the first people to document Afro-Cuban religion. So Eric, for sure, 100% would have known that Balize is known as Sword of Shango in Cuba, and that the people who live in large part in Laventille, Belmont areas would have been bonded laborers who would have come from Oyo province, which is the state where Shango is the patron Orisha, right? So I'm saying all of that to say that absolutely I agree with Sunity that there was this feeling between Indians and Africans that they were not being seen by the mainstream of the party, which had put on, as George Orwell says, the clothes and started walking on 2 feet, 4 feet good, 2 feet a little bit better. You know,
yeah, but let's also not for me, part of having the honest discussion is also not downplaying the deep divides and problems that we have, right? So we do
absolutely not. I don't want to say that there are divides, but I also want to say that there is the whole idea of competing patriarchies, and if I could get you to be on my side by saying that, well, I look like you, so how you could choose that other person against me? Absolutely, that is part of what is causing problems. But I also want to say that there are a lot of similarities, and I just want to big up Ravi Ji again, who formed an organization called Astral, which is the Association of Traditional Religious Expression in Trinidad. So you have indigenous people, African people, and Hindu people getting together and talking about some of the challenges that they are facing. You know, let's not forget that a couple of years ago in Antigua, there was a situation where under the Obia laws that are still existing in Antigua, 2 pundits were expelled. They were actually deported for doing rituals there. And so, there are all of these opportunities for us to get together and say, we are not that dissimilar. And there are people who are doing that work in the society, and we need to give them space and respect to do the work that they're doing. Sunity is one of them. Ravi Ji is one of them. Ravi Ji has a whole group of people, young people that he's working with, young women that he's working with from his community to do that kind of work. And we also, in the African community, need to do that work of reaching out and saying, we are not the enemy. We need to do the work together. We need to, because if I understand myself and if I'm strong in my sense of myself, there's no reason for me to oppress you. We have problems when people are unsure of themselves or unsure of their history or unsure of their position in the society. We see a lot of aggressive insecurity playing out as racism in the place. And we just really need to address, well, what is behind you acting out like that? What is the story behind you acting out like that? And when we go behind and we get these stories, we'll see what it is really going on. And sometimes it's just that people do not have information and they're not educated. So we go back again into the question of how we are educating ourselves.
I think
Yes,
if you draw a line from the Muharram massacre, which is its anniversary is next month, so that's an opportunity again for learning. You can just straight lines of attempts to get together that you could draw,
yes.
and it goes beyond 1970, because after 1970 you had a seriously repressive state. This is people down there locked up in Nelson Island, state of emergency. Then you had the rise of NUF, and you all know that's when you had the killings, the police killings, and the guerrilla activity that started in the absence of representation that NJAC was providing. And you got to the point where people were on officially banned lists from the state-owned sole TV station, trade unions, political leaders, just generally people who were opponents of the state. We went through a whole half a decade like that, and it gave rise again to another version of what we saw in 1970 through the United Labour Front. Before it was a political party, it was Sugars, Oil and Sugar Unite, and it was a powerful movement that led to another event of Bloody Tuesday in 1975.
1975, yeah.
That's right.
Sorry, Amilcar, just to cut you, but I just want to continue along with that line, just to say, let's not forget Adrian Kula-Renzi with Butler and Stephen Maharaj with CLR James, and that continual attempt to unite the races, you know?
And let's not forget Cipriani, right? No. I mean, some people want to start our labor movement from 1937, and that's fine, but this is the year, 1919 to 1920, that the really most powerful expression, I mean, it exploded and crippled the whole of Trinidad and Tobago, the dock worker strike, that fueled strikes all over, and sugar workers, and they beat up the overseer and all these things, was 1920 with Cipriani. And his partner was Butler. Right, his partner was Butler, who was in the British West Indian Regiment. Sorry, Amilcar.
No, it's a problem. The question, I'll be brief, is that I think we have to look at cultural moments and what they register. And I really identify with Chike more about this, because Chike was trying to acknowledge what a movement also does not do in a time. And I think it's a duty of many movements afterwards, organizations after, to see the shortcomings, to see why it didn't make that turn, why it didn't mobilize and bring out new forces. And we have always seen key leaders or key persons who don't seem to be in the identity of the oppressed group immediately ally themselves. And that is why we could identify them more easily. But to say that there was interracial unity across the broad movement, that has been called into question, I think rightly so. So for example, like even my family is from Tamana, you know, a lot of them didn't really identify with what was going on in Port of Spain. That was a movement happening almost outside of them. And even I have I'm going to say who it is, a family member who heard gorillas were attacking people in the mountain, thinking an animal was coming out and attacking persons. So even the consciousness, I think we shouldn't overstate how that consciousness was diffused throughout the society equally. But I'll just go to...
There were quite a number of African Trinidadians who didn't share the view either.
Of course, and that is the point. And I think it's when we have solidarities, not if we have them. We do have them, but the moments, and Attillah was talking about that, it was resistance to the dominance of the PNM, and there was a certain type of solidarity, but it didn't translate into votes when NJAC competed into the elections. So there's a way solidarities happen, and when solidarities don't happen, and I think we need to think about a race-class analysis all the time. Chike kind of raised a point. In a course I taught geopolitics and political geography, we focus entirely on Guyana. Because the students here, even though the majority of the classroom might be from Trinidad, is that picture. that picture of Cherry Jagan and Forbes Burnham going to England to negotiate independence, waving off the plane, is that moment that even now they are torn apart, the country would have to live with the consequence of that. That picture in Black Power, there's my last point. I remember watching that picture when I was like 17, like 2008 maybe. No, I'm in September, 18 or 19. And I saw that picture and then I said, that is not me. You wouldn't believe that. And I'm not seeing that picture to say I critique it. I just didn't feel I needed to march with Indians to say I was down with them for their cause. And it was so funny because so many years afterwards, even the image and the message it was communicating, I think it was different because perhaps I did not live such a divided life in the East-West corridor with us and Indians. And that is why the Black Lives Matter movement would have in Trinidad, I talk about the contemporary one, would have to confront a real issue. You know, a lot of the focus started to come around the issue of white privilege, interracial solidarity, and I think the question of Indians and racial justice was not being taken up in the earliest part, or not by probably dominant leaders, the most persons at the forefront. And that is why it will keep moving. So BLM started in a certain way. It started embassy politics, then it went to MOVA. Then the question of elections came up, which really had conflicted loyalties. A lot of people who were hardcore on racial justice wanted to get back in the political fold because for them, their blackness meant a cultural politics, but not one that would challenge their political ones and political party ones. And that is why I think it's complex and a race class analysis is always important.
We're wrapping up now with 3 minutes left. And I think that, just one person had a comment here about what specificities differentiated those Indians who did and did not engage. What facets of the movement were most, I don't think we have the time to answer that question, but I hope the person found some answers that the reality is somewhere between these extremes and is the work of scholars and storytellers and people who live through things or know things to document so that people can go and find it there. And there's so many opportunities now to just put your voice note or sit down in front of a camera and record it. Last thoughts, everybody? Attillah?
I just want to give thanks to my my parents, for giving me a heavy burden to carry. 1970 was not an easy thing that happened. We didn't just get African names. We got a lot of trauma. We got a lot of isolation. We got a lot of people laughing at us. I remember being in Standard 5 and hearing the teacher ask, "What is NJAC?" And a teacher and a child responding, "National Jambi attacking the country." And the teacher laughing until tears came to her eyes. And me keeping quiet because these are my people, these are my friends, these are the people who I spend all my time with. And so I want to focus on healing and forgiveness and acknowledgement that the people who lived through 1970, their voices deserve to be heard. Those of them who are still with us, their stories deserve to be heard. Their voices deserve to be heard. And their contribution to who we are right now needs to be acknowledged and needs to be given some visibility as we move forward and as we try to make sense of what we have now. We really need to go back and look into our history and try and contextualize their pain, their trauma, and how that is still informing what is going on in the society now.
Okay, well, I think we will just leave it at that. Ashe, Shanti, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.